Chapter 33. Wednesday dinner time. Lynette beamed and ran past Doreen, who spun to look at the tall silver-haired gentleman in the doorway. He caught Lynette and kissed her gently, then looked at Doreen and asked, "Are you harassing my wife?" "Not at all," Doreen said with a bright smile. "Just asking her questions about her role in Manny's death." The man's face turned sheer white. "What? What did you just say?" "But she clarified a few points for me," Doreen said. "She said she wasn't involved, and I believe her now. It was done by your hands alone." The man protested. Lynette turned to Doreen and said, "What?" Doreen nodded. "You wouldn't leave your husband. Your husband was a disgrace. Manny was something that shouldn't even be allowed to exist according to you. So Dean took them both out of the equation with that lovely black truck," she said. "The black truck you no longer drive, right? The one without a license plate that's in the garage." He shook his head slowly, like a bull in a china shop, preparing to charge. Doreen held up her hand and said, "Stop. Don't even bother. The cops found Manny's body. They're all over the forensics on it now." If she'd thought Dean'd been white before, now he had almost translucent skin. She turned to Lynette and motioned to Dean's face. "See? Guilt. He gets Manny to come with him by pretending to be a John, takes him out, kills him, and buries him out at Paul's tomb. After that, he waits a few days and hits Norbert with his truck. Norbert doesn't survive, and everything's all free and clear. Hell, Norbert probably was stealing from the bank to finance his escape with Manny. Did you grab the money from his car at the same time? You get to keep your assets, and within 30 days, he's got you locked up tight as his wife. Nobody's the wiser." She turned to face Dean. "What do you call it? Taking out the trash?" "That's not bad," Dean said. His voice was a deep growl, as if some rage was building inside. "That's a pretty story. Not that it matters. Neither one of them deserved to live. I'm sure your wife agreed with you." Lynette stared at her husband, then back at Doreen. Then she took a step back. "Is that right, Dean? Did you run poor Norbert down?" "Poor Norbert? That man wasn't a man, he was a two-timing thief," he snapped. "You know perfectly well you wanted him dead. He was under suspicion for stealing from the bank. He was having sex with that thing on the streets and bringing home every disease possible. Of course I was unhappy. But I didn't want him killed." "So you would have been happy if he had just died from a heart attack or some major disease?" Doreen asked. The woman nodded. "Exactly. I wanted it all to go away, but didn't want him killed." "Too bad," Doreen said cheerfully. "Because Dean did it for you." The woman stared at Doreen and back at Dean. She shook her head. "Please tell me that you didn't. Please. Please tell me." She reached up to gently cup his cheeks. "I've loved you for so long. Please tell me that you didn't do this." "Everything I've done, I did for you," he said brokenly to Lynette. "Because you wouldn't leave him, I had to." Through the open front door, Doreen could see several vehicles pulling up, sirens blazing. Dean didn't even bother glancing behind him. Doreen smiled. "Well, you'll get to say it all over again many times," she said, "because here's your ride." Dean glared at her and said, "Do you think I'll just walk out of here?" He stiffened his back, straightened up, and said, "It's your word against mine. The cops can go over the truck. I don't care." "Not just my word against you," she said. "We have a lot of witnesses now. And of course, Manny is just now telling his story too." Dean grimaced at the thought and shook his head. "You don't know anything." "I know that Manny struggled," she said. "Manny fought for his life. And at the very end, you wouldn't even give him the mercy of being found, so his family could mourn. And then, when you came back from killing Manny, you were completely casual about the whole thing and never said a word to anybody. After that, you plotted poor Norbert's downfall. And that was way too easy, wasn't it? Now here, 10 years later, you've got it all. You've got the fancy house, the beautiful wife, the great job, you're the king of your castle. Doreen gave them a smile that would put anybody on edge. Except for Dean, because he was too arrogant to see it. But you built it all on a crumbling foundation. You made it out of murder and lies. Lynette gripped his hands and whispered, "Please tell me the truth." He reached down gently, kissed her on the forehead, and said, "Don't worry about it." You noticed he never said no, Doreen said cheerfully. Lynette looked at Doreen, then at her husband. "Dean, I want you to tell me right now by looking in my eyes." He smiled and cupped her cheek. "Why would you even listen to this woman?" "See," Doreen said. Once again, he didn't say no. Behind him, she could see Mac walking up the sidewalk. Several other men headed to the garage. She looked at Dean and said, "You can't say it because it's a lie, and you can't lie to her because you love her. You killed her husband just to free her up so she could be with you." Dean stared at his wife and his shoulders sagged. He slowly whispered, "I killed him. I had to. You wouldn't leave him. You wouldn't leave that lousy, sniveling little worm for me. I had to do something." Lynette shook her head, her hand clasped over her mouth as she cried, "No, no, please no." He reached out for her, but she took a step back. Doreen was just about to congratulate herself on having gotten one case closed without actually getting hurt, when Dean turned, grabbed something from the sideboard that held his keys, and swung it in Doreen's direction. She took a glass bowl hard in her chest, crying out as she stumbled back, falling to the floor. Thaddeus squawked and flew free. She was okay, but it knocked the wind out of her. She could hear Lynette screaming in the background and asking Dean to stop. But he picked up something else and lunged toward Doreen to smash it into her. As he took 2 steps, Muggs jumped at him. Only Dean kicked Muggs away. Muggs fell over, whining, as Goliath lunged upward, digging his claws into Dean's lean belly. Dean roared and tried to brush Goliath off, but Muggs was back at Dean again. Not to be outdone, Thaddeus flew onto Dean's distinguished hair, sending it flying everywhere. He dug his claws in and pecked away. Dean roared in anger, frustration, and pain, as the animals attacked him at all once. And finally, over all of it, Doreen felt warm arms wrap around her and help her to her feet. Mac's voice came through the din. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him gratefully, and nodded. "I will be." "Good. You might want to call off your defenders then, please." She gave a sharp whistle, and Muggs returned to her side, while Goliath shot her a look as if to say, it was really getting good now. But still, he dropped from Dean's midsection to the floor and sauntered toward her. Then Mac scooped up Thaddeus and plunked him on Doreen's shoulder, while they all watched the wreckage of the man in front of them, crying. Dean was still standing, but he was torn and bleeding. "Looks like Doreen strikes again," Mac said. 2 cops behind him chuckled. "Looks like Doreen and her army strike again," they said. Doreen looked over at Mac and said, "The black truck's in the garage. You know that, right?" "I know it now," he said. "I don't think Lynette had anything to do with any of the killings, but she tipped me off." Lynette stared at Doreen. "What are you talking about?" "You paid Manny money to disappear," Doreen said. That made no sense. How could it not make sense? She was humiliating me. My life was a mess because of her. How could it not make sense to get rid of her? "Sure, but somebody did get rid of him," Doreen corrected. "And if it wasn't you, then who?" "It had to be somebody who cared. And that led me to the man who loved you enough to kill for you. But once he got rid of one nasty irritant in your life, he got rid of the one nasty irritant in his life." She glanced at the animals huddled close to her side. "You see, when you love someone, you do almost anything to save them." "But not murder," Mac said with a note of warning. Doreen laughed. "Never murder. Besides, whoever threw all that stuff into Richard's garden, they had no idea what they started. Handcuffs in the heather, indeed. Yeah, so now what? Something starting with I. I hope not, she said with a shudder. The only thing that comes to mind is ice. Don't like the sound of that. I'm a sun-loving girl. Don't like the cold much. Then don't think about it, Max said comfortably. Maybe you're done now. Got all this amateur sleuth stuff out of your system. If that's the only other option, she said as she scowled at him, I'll take ice. After all, how hard could it be? The big lake freezes over here, so maybe someone else is lost in the lake. Mac rolled his eyes at her. Knowing you, you'll compound the issue and make it an ice pick as the murder weapon. She glared at him. Knowing me. Is that an insult? He laughed. Come on. Let's get you home. Whatever the next case is, it's not today's issue. Doreen let him lead her out to her car, and instead of helping her in, he took her around to the passenger side and loaded her and the animals up, then got in on the driver's side. She had to admit, she was a little shaky. So being driven home was a novelty she would enjoy. Besides, it gave her time to consider ice picks. Not a bad idea at all.